we need to talk about Karl Marx. Now, I know he looks like a kind of like a Santa scientist style figure, but he is also one of the key founders of socialist ideas, and to many is seen as a hero and one of the most important thinkers of the 19th century. To others, he is seen as the author of an ideology which has caused misery to millions. And therefore, whichever side of that particular debate you are, he is a very important figure. And in this video, we're going to be talking about him, his ideas. We're going to be talking about the socialist values on human nature and what this means to society. This is the second video looking at political ideas. So if you haven't yet watched, looking at socialism. So if you haven't yet watched the video about the core ideas of socialism, then I would strongly recommend starting with that one, because that would make this video make a lot more sense. So if we just start off, before we talk about Marx in particular, we'll talk about human nature and how this works. And it's important with any ideology that ideological ideas often start by discussing what humans are like, or should be like, or could be like, and therefore extrapolate out, therefore, well, if humans are like this, then society can be like this, and therefore the state should be like this, and therefore the economy can be like this. They kind of come in a little chain, and you could probably argue about what order we put in the kind of the state and society and the economy, because they're all kind of interlinked with one another and so on. But human nature has to come first. Because if human nature, as liberals think, are rational, individualist kind of creatures that know what's best for them, are capable of making their own decisions, and are ultimately selfish, then therefore society and the state and the economy must reflect what human beings are really like. If, as perhaps Hobbes thinks under conservatives, conservatism, that human beings are far more kind of like negative creatures, we're far more kind of competitive, and we are in a kind of a state of war with one another, then therefore we're going to need a far more authoritative government that has sovereignty over us to kind of keep us in check, and therefore society must have some sort of kind of hierarchy, blah, 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 blah. Do you see the point I'm making? The human nature must come first. That leads on to everything else. So therefore, if socialism believes, from the previous video, in collectivism, in that kind of cooperative nature of humanity, then we need to first ask the question, well, what do they think about us? What do socialists believe that human beings are actually like in order for this to work? And it must be different to perhaps what we've seen with the other two ideologies. So socialists believe or are far more optimistic about human nature and about what we are like. We are, according to socialists, we are at our core social creatures who cooperate with one another. So social creatures, we are part of communities. We like to talk and support and live and work alongside one another. And these ideas are not crazy. These are not extreme ideas. I mean, just think about your life, think about your families and so on. And yes, some of us are more social than others, introverts, extroverts, etc., etc. But to the biggest extent, we live our lives alongside others without bludgeoning each other to death, and work to the benefit of ourselves, but we're not trying most of the time to kind of do that at the expense of others. But we live under a capitalist system where if my business is to succeed, then someone else's business is to fail. We live in a society where the accumulation of wealth is seen as a good thing. We're always trying to get a bigger house and a better standard of living for our family, and this kind of comes from a kind of an individualist mindset on human nature. And socialists have argued that our human nature is social. We are cooperative, but our human nature is also malleable. Now, malleable is a word we often use when we talk about clay and kind of pottery, when you have something like kind of Play-Doh or wet clay, it is malleable, it is shapeable. You can kind of move it and change it into whatever you want it to be. And many socialists would argue that our human nature is changeable and adaptable and can be different depending on the society that you grow up in. So follow this line of thought. If you grow up in a capitalist society, you will have a capitalist, individualist human nature. But if you grew up in a socialist society based on cooperation, community, and collectivism, then your human nature, and they would argue your true human nature, will be allowed out, will be allowed to flourish, and you will be far less selfish. Because some people's instant reaction to socialism is to go, lovely idea, would never work because human beings ultimately are selfish. And the socialist response to that is, sure, but that's only because they've grown up in a selfish society. And if they grew up in a different society, then they would be different. And then at that point, you can then kind of debate. But it's important to acknowledge that socialists understand and are fully aware that many human beings are not cooperative and are not, do not kind of prioritize the community above themselves. And this is their explanation. And so they argue that capitalism indoctrinates. That means it's almost like a religious word. If I was to force you to become a member of Coxism, that would be indoctrinating you with my particular kind of values. And they argue that capitalism indoctrinates greed, and therefore capitalism is bad because it just encourages us all to be nasty to each other and to try and exploit one another. Or to use perhaps what Marx was kind of explaining, if you were the factory owner, you would be treating the factory workers terribly. Capitalism creates monsters, creates competition. And if you look at, and when I've kind of done these ideologies, I'm trying to support each ideology. So probably when you're watching the liberal videos, you'll be like, he's a liberal. When you're watching the conservative videos, you'll be like, he's a conservative. And so I'm going to do the same here. I'm going to support each of these views as I'm explaining them. But think about the 2008 financial crash. Think about the money that some of the bankers made. Think about how many people felt exploited and used by others. Maybe capitalism does encourage unhealthy competitiveness amongst humanity. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it actually encourages healthy competitiveness. You can go another way. Others would argue, perhaps like Milton Friedman, would argue that actually greed is good. To quote a famous film. But there is some disagreement here amongst socialists. Some socialists would argue actually we do have a kind of some selfish tendencies. But probably the most important point here is that second bullet point. It's that they believe that human nature is at its fundamental point when human beings were created, born, or evolved, whatever, social creatures who live and work together rather than competitive creatures who are designed to compete. And if you kind of think about the animal kingdom here, and we'll be getting back to the animal kingdom when we get to anarchism, which is probably making your brain go, what? Different thinkers have compared human beings to different types of animal. And you've got to kind of think, in your view, do you see human beings more like, let's think of a good example here, like polar bears, who kind of go out on their own? Or do you see us more as bees, where we all kind of work together? Or do you see us more like lions, where you have a pride and a kind of community that are together, that occasionally excludes certain kind of members? What are human beings by nature? If you were to kind of group all animals by how collective they are versus how individual they are, where would you put human beings on that scale? And depending on where you put human beings, then think, of course, well, what does that lead to in terms of economy, society, and the state? Because human nature is important. So now we kind of know where Karl Marx is kind of coming from with his human nature. Let's talk a little bit about Marx in general. So, in case I haven't got my point across yet, he argues that the original nature of human beings is cooperative, supportive, collective, and more than happy to exist to put the collective needs above others. And he is the key thinker who is arguing that capitalism causes greed. You know, he is, when it comes to the ideas of revolution and anti-capitalist thinking, it is Marx that argues that capitalism, it simply must go. It is just an evil that has arisen out of liberal industrial revolution thinking. And remember, he's seen it. Okay, he's not just some nut job sitting there kind of going, bah, you know, private ownership. You know, he is seeing what exploitative factory owners are doing to people, and therefore he reaches the, probably for his time, entirely logical conclusion that this is bad. You know, today we see a far more moderate version where living standards of the working classes and the poorer classes is so much better than it was 200 years ago. And he kind of sees society as a competition between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. There is class warfare under Marx. It is not possible for these two to reconcile. We cannot, you know, think about one nation conservative, you know, organic society, we are all one, the palace is not safe when the cottage is not happy, noblesse oblige, you know, all these ideas that come in conservatism are rejected utterly by Marx, because he divides us into these exploiters and the exploitees and says, look at what one group is doing to another. This is so wrong. And so, excuse me. And so he argues for class struggle. And here's our first quote from him. Workers of the world, unite. Lower classes, factory workers, come together. There is more of you. Together we are stronger. We do not have to put up with this. We do not have to take this. Come together as one, unite, be a community, and we must revolt. He argues that a liberal state is a capitalist state. And when we use the word liberal, especially in the United Kingdom, it does have a different kind of meaning and context in America. But he argues that a liberal state, when we talk about these ideas of freedom and rationalism and individualism, you know, it sounds good, but what is the end goal, the end outcome of liberalism? It is a form of free market capitalism. And capitalism causes greed. And capitalism leads to the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And therefore, a liberal state, based on the values of democracy and freedom, is wrong. It will have a bad outcome. And so therefore, Marx rejects and would reject what he probably sees that liberal democracies are and what they have become. And so he argues, and this is perhaps the bit of Marx which is the hardest bit to kind of go ooh about. He argues that violent revolution is inevitable. It is going to happen. The workers of the workers of the world must unite, and the oppressors must be forcibly removed and thrown out. And of course, in our modern world, in the Western world especially, we see change coming through democracy, through voting, through popular opinion. But of course, in many countries, it hasn't been that way. You know, if they've had to throw off oppression and violent dictators, there's had to be revolution. If you think about the Arab Spring from about 10, 15 years ago that took place all across the Middle East, when various rulers like Gaddafi and Mubarak in Egypt were removed. Dictators don't tend to just go, you know? They tend to have to be forcibly removed. And remember, Marx is also writing at a time before the enfranchisement of large amounts of the populace and women. And his ideas, of course, could be different if he was writing maybe in 1945, when he's just seen the first Labour government to arrive in the UK. He is writing at a point where he does not see a functioning democracy where people are able to make their own decisions, and therefore his logical conclusion is the only way that workers will bring about change is revolution. And it probably sounds like here like I'm trying to justify violent revolution. I'm not. I'm trying to justify how he makes why his conclusion is not as extreme as it might seem to us, because of the world and the countries that he lives in, and how he can see the only ways that change is really going to be taking place. So what? Okay, so we have the revolution, glorious. Then what? Well, he would then put in place a socialist state. And this socialist state, so government, he's putting in a socialist government, which is then going to enforce public ownership. And in the previous video, I talked about this idea of public ownership and the workers owning the means of production. I gave you the example of the NHS, which is the British National Health Service. But this would be happening en masse under a socialist state. That business, that you know, and everything from health to food would become a collectively owned industry that we would all partially own and all partially benefit from, and would not be there to exploit us. And then he then argues for a dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, that means basically a people's government. He is not a Democrat. He is arguing that for some people, how they are chosen is perhaps less clear, as a result of this revolution, to set up and enforce a socialist state. And this is where Marx then starts to, you can kind of start to see where figures like Lenin and Mao kind of come from here, because he is arguing in effect that someone or some group needs to take control and then enforce a socialist scenario on the country, and that this will be a dictatorship of some kind. Now, I was watching a video earlier that was talking about different types of socialism, and the video is making a really good point. And it says, when you're looking at socialism and perhaps communism, and you're looking at historical examples of it, it's important to compare Russia and China in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and the horrific things that took place there, but also to compare that with countries, Scandinavian countries, which are democracies, but have a lot of socialist values kind of underpinning them, and to take a step back and to say, look, there are many different ways in which socialist values can be seen. Socialism does not always lead to Stalin. Socialism can lead to very gentle, community-based countries. So if you know, have a Google and you know, Google things like, you know, is Norway a socialist country or something like that, and just be aware, some people will see these values here and think, oh my goodness, Chairman Mao killing millions. And you know, there is a line to be drawn between Marx and that, but there is also a line to be drawn between Karl Marx and our own NHS, which many people hold very dear, and Scandinavian countries that have a lot more socialist values in them than even the UK. So the point that I'm making here is, don't make the mistake of thinking that socialism is Stalinism, is Maoism. It can be seen in lots of different ways, in lots of different countries, over time. Now, I'll explore this in probably the next slide. But Marx sees socialism as a stepping stone towards full communism, where a state will be removed. And in fact, I'll skip onto the slide that kind of shows that, and so we can kind of explore this idea in a bit more detail. If you're in my class in 2021, I've kind of explored this slide with you before, and I'm not going to go into full detail. And I nicked this one from online, so you can probably find it if you kind of Google it. If you Google like Marx and class struggle, but Marx is arguing that the history goes through many civilizations go through stages, and they are all on a journey from slaving empires to communism, going through these various stages. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview here, and you can pause the slide and kind of read this in kind of more detail. But he argues that all societies kind of start with empires run by God-given emperors that enslave their citizens. which then over time, through class struggle, then leads to feudal kingdoms where you get a kind of a king and a lord, but they're no longer slaves. You've now kind of got vassals. And then through class struggle and revolution and war, you then get the rise of liberalism and capitalism and capitalist values and individualist values. And this is where Marx is writing. So when Marx is writing, he is living at this third stage. But there is still class struggle here now between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And he's giving examples to here, by the way, on this slide of these different societies which are at these different stages. But for a liberal, capitalism is probably your end goal. Stop here. Nozick and Ayn Rand, this is it. But for him, this is also a stage that will go. And he argues that the next stage is a socialist republic, whereby you get a government which is now going to change it round. So rather than having some sort of small authority in control of everyone, we now have some sort of large authority which is doing things on behalf of everyone. Now I'll just read the description under the fourth box there. Workers unite to claim public ownership of the lands, factories, and nature and manage them collectively for the good of society. And then once this socialist republic is in place, over time, the values of the people will change. Remember, human nature is malleable. And once socialism becomes the embedded mindset of the community, the state which is enforcing these values will become unnecessary. And a key phrase for you here, and it will wither away. Almost like a rotting tree. The state will become unnecessary once socialist values have permeated society, and that will lead to, looking at the final box, to full world communism. And looking there, it says, class, state, and property are all abolished, and all the people of the earth live and labour together in a truly free and equal society. And looking at, as it's Squidward at the bottom there, everybody's chill. At every stage of society here, you've got struggle between various groups. So behind my head here, I think we've got the slavers and the slaves. Here we've got the royalty and the vassals. We've got the bourgeois and the proletariat. Here we've got the state and the workers. But once we reach glorious end goal communism, everybody's chill, because we have now reached an even and equal society. And Marx is keen to point out that you can't just jump to stage 5. You have to go through these different stages. And so, going back to what I said before, one of the key and obvious and important criticisms of Marx is to kind of say, look at what happened in China. Look at what happened in Russia. Look at the death and the suffering and the horrific events that took place in those countries. The counter-argument from Marxists is that, well, though none of those countries went through all of the stages, it was almost like trying to run a marathon before you've ever been for a jog. You have to prepare your society and your country to be able to have communism by going through the capitalist and then the socialist and finally the communist stages. And I think that is an interesting debate. If you know your history and if you know more about China and Russia and what kind of took place there, is there an alternative world where they went through the stages where the outcome was different? Or is socialism and communism always going to lead to Stalin and Mao and what took place? But that would be the Marx response. So I probably need to stop the video here because I've been going on kind of 24 minutes. So in the next video, which will probably be looking at the next week, we'll talk about society and we'll talk about Luxembourg, and we'll start to move into the different parts and stages of socialism. I hope you found this video interesting. If you liked it, then don't forget to like it. Hopefully you've learned loads, and I will see you in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.